So assessment tools. Personally, I have experience with going into zoos and assess zoo enclosures here in Ontario. I just want to emphasize that no matter if you go into a house or in an MLab facility or a zoo facility, the needs of the animals remain the same. So it doesn't matter if a monkey is a pet monkey or it's a monkey in a zoo, the requirements won't change. So a lot of these examples will be zoo examples, but you can apply it in any situation. So the first assessment tools I'll be talking about are tools that will give you an idea how well an animal is doing. So when I went to school, the first one they would introduce, and the only one I ever knew about until I started reading about things, was the 5 freedoms. And it was mentioned earlier in Alex's presentation. So that covers the freedom of hunger and thirst, discomfort, pain, injury, disease, fear and distress, and the freedom to express normal behaviors. And this, in principle, is a great system because it touches upon all the factors that affects an animal's well-being, its state of mind. The only thing what we're currently looking into is not only to remove any issues and any problematic environments to ensure that we meet certain requirements, but we want to enhance the animal's life. And that's what this system lacks. It doesn't look in how we can enhance an animal's well-being. So that's where the 5-domain model comes in, and this is a more holistic approach of how to look at an animal's well-being. And it identifies a level of compromise for nutrition, the environment, health and behavior, and therefore captures the mental state of an animal. And they talk about, this system talks about the affective state, so the emotional state of an animal, which can either be positive or negative. And they have 2 ways to kind of change the negative state into a positive state. The first one is when an animal experiences a negative state, like hunger or thirst, it will go out and it will perform foraging behavior. It will eat, and therefore the negative state will turn into the positive state, which is very naturalistic behavior. And yeah, it's part of being an animal, being a human being. You affect negative moments, and you can deal with those because you are able to perform behaviors that will take those negative moments away. Then we have the second one, and this is mostly refers to animals in captivity, is that the state of a barren environment that will obviously cause an animal to suffer. We can replace that for positive environments, enriched environments. So that's a direct correlation of taking away the negative state and allowing an animal to experience a positive state. In theory, it's a very good assessment tool. However, you need a substantial amount of knowledge of the animal, because what they do in this tool, they want you to grade the affective state. So you need to know how much does a negative state actually affect the animal. And as you can see here, we go from none to severe. So if you look, for example, at drinking water, an animal goes completely without water, which would affect it very badly, or only for 2 hours or for 3 hours. So you need to be able to make that, you have to be able to do those criteria and to know how it affects the state, which makes it kind of complicated. The next one, this is more practical, and I've used this one as a tool myself. However, what I usually do is that I try to keep, I read up on new assessment tools that come out, and I pick out what I need, because some aren't as practical as others, some don't apply to certain animals. So that will be my advice to you. Whenever you read through assessment tools, it doesn't mean implement it exactly as it is in the literature, because sometimes it's just not practical, but pick out what you need and go with that. So the Zoocheck, it's an easy tool. It was developed by Rob Laidlaw. It's an easy tool because it's based on yes and no questions. Do you see water? Yes. Do you see food? No. And then every statement is weighted by a certain amount of points. If a facility passes the 40 points, it passes the test and it's acceptable or a good facility. If it doesn't, then it fails the test. Also, what I like about this is that there are 3 automatic failures. So if a facility or an enclosure, if you see an enclosure that has severely compromised conditions, for example, an animal can't stretch, which would pretty much be any reptile enclosure that you'll face, that's an automatic failure. would you see an enclosure that has 90 to 100% hardwired or hard substrate? That's an automatic failure because it affects the behavior. Animals get or issues with their paws or their claws, so that's an important one because animals are in that enclosure for probably their entire lives. And then the third one, which is an automatic failure, is barren exhibits. So enclosures that lack any naturalistic environment, lack any enrichment. Then this framework was also touched upon Alex a little bit earlier. This one is based on 2 or 3 main criteria. The first one is that the well-being of a pet should not be jeopardized. And ideally, for an animal to be in captivity, it should enhance its life. So it's not only that for us humans, that if we have a pet and we're like, oh my God, like it protects us or it gives us company, that feeling or that state of mind, an animal should experience that as well. The other 2 criteria is that it cannot be harmful or dangerous to the community or the environment. This is the checklist that goes with this assessment tool. And again, it's extensive. And for me, it's not practical because I often go into facilities that I wasn't asked going to. So I'm there as a visitor, and to walk around with like, a list and go off and go by every enclosure and fill in what's questioned is not practical for me. I usually have 4 or 5 hours to do this. So again, I'm aware of what they ask for and what they look at, and I pick out what I need. And also with most assessment tools, it's never 100% objective. So if you send somebody to a facility, you might want to check or have a sort of test run before, so you kind of, your assessment of a situation and your values and your ethical mindset is similar to the person you send out, because otherwise you'll come back with different results. So there are other assessment tools. You see the E-mode and the guidelines for companion and commercial animal establishment, and Clifford will talk about that next, so I won't touch upon that. And then there are other assessment tools that will either indicate if animals are suitable or not suitable to be pets, or assessment tools that will indicate if you can assess in a facility with that. Again, I don't go over all of these. The only thing I can tell you, be aware of them. New ones are coming out frequently, and there's a lot of useful information in there. So going on to my experience, when I assess an animal facility, I go in, I often don't know what I'm getting myself into. Some facilities, some zoos, they have 5 enclosures or 10. Some have 500 enclosures. So you don't know the territory, you don't know the number of enclosures or the species that you will find. And there's always a lack of time in my experience. So that's a reason why I don't go around with those assessment tools and try to follow their steps. I just go in, collect as many data as I can, and then when I'm home, I try to put everything together with literature and the data that I collected myself. So I'm going to go over some of my examples that I would like to share. And again, keep in mind, these are mostly zoo examples, but this could be anywhere. So the first picture here, for example, this is a pet monkey enclosure in a house. And this is a fox enclosure in one of the zoos near Ottawa. So the first thing I look at, if I, pretty much step out of the car or enter the zoo, is I look at the general layout, and I look at how the enclosures are built. And mainly I try to see does the animal have any privacy? What are the dimensions of the enclosure? Is the enclosure protected from severe weather, especially in Canada with all the snow and the storms? You want to make sure that an animal ideally has at least 2 or 3 enclosed walls, so it can has privacy from people and can get away from the view of people whenever it wants to, but also to protect itself from the weather. And for me, very important when I walk into a zoo facility or the AMLET facility I did, it's how many staff is present. Because taking care of animals is a 24/7 task, as we all know. I've been to zoos where literally no one was walking around. I was by myself for 2 hours. That should not happen, and it is an indication. It's not conclusive, but it is an indication that the management is not taking their job serious. All right. So what I look at next, this is a bear enclosure in Sault-Ste-Marie. What I look at is if I know the species and I know the naturalistic environment they belong to, does it compare at all? And I don't think this one needs many words to say it doesn't. Another thing to look at is, does the enclosure allow for natural behaviors? So for a bear, usually they like swimming, climbing, and digging. So kind of all three elements, which makes usually their enclosures very complicated. And this lacks all of them. All right. Next step, look at enrichment. What I want to say about enrichment is that, in my experience, enrichment is this popular term used by people in animal management or zoos, and they kind of throw in a ball and like, oh, that's enrichment. Or they throw in a log and be like, well, the animal can play with that. That's not enrichment. Enrichment is an active tool that should be used and analyzed and reviewed like every other day, every week, as much as possible, because animals get used to their enclosures and they will end up not using the things you offer them. A very good way of enriching animals' lives is like doing food enrichment, for example, which is you feed them every day, make it interesting for them at least. So I will look at like with this one, they have some balls, they have some logs, but obviously it's pretty barren. So for enrichment, what I do is I look at, has it been used? Like what's the state of the item? Is it hooked in somewhere that it can't be replaced? Is it species appropriate? Which is another big one. Because again, giving, I don't know, a reptile a swing or something, that might not be as effective. But like again, it has to be very species appropriate. And then again, if you don't know something, you can always look it up in the literature afterwards. The next thing I do is I look for signs for abnormal behavior or behaviors that might show that the animal isn't happy. What you see a lot with like big cats or wolf species is that they do a lot of pacing. And even though you might not see the behavior when you're at the facility, worn out paths like these are a clear indication that certain areas in the enclosures are used very often, which, write that down and then you can make an argument for that. All right, so this is a facility in Sudbury, and this enclosure had about 10 turtles and 2 crocodiles, 15 turtles. It had 1 pool and it had 1 heat lamp. So this is the next thing I'd like to talk about, is about the amount of space animals are given and the amount of animals that are using the space. So there are terms for that. You have crypto overcrowding and overt overcrowding. So overt overcrowding, if there are too many animals in a single space, and again, Clifford will talk about that a little bit later. What you see here is crypto overcrowding. So within an enclosure, the facilities for an animal, so to eat, to drink, to regulate their temperature, it should be available to all animals at all times. Because animals should have the choice and should not have to wait around for another animal to be able to drink or feed or whatever. So in this case, there was only 1 heat lamp for all the animals, which forced the turtle to climb on the back of the alligator or crocodile in order to get its heat. Which, again, it's not a situation you want to put the animals in. All right, and one of the last things I look at is behavior. For me personally, I finished my master's degree in chimpanzee behavior, and that was a research I'd done over 3-4 months, watching the animals every single day for hours on the same time, or like hours in a day. So behavioral research, technically, if you're only there for an hour, I'd never feel really comfortable to be like, oh my God, I saw this animal pace, so therefore there's bad animal welfare. Because some animals are known to get like really excited when it's feeding time, and they will perform certain behaviors that are not natural in captivity. However, what you can look at is the state of the animal and its condition. So here it's the same bear as the bear enclosure I showed earlier. And you can see its fur is very dull, very patchy. You can see it was lethargic at that point in time. So most animals, they will come, they're curious or they get away from you. If there's no response at all at a new stimuli, if there's a new person or anything happens around that enclosure, an animal should react. If it doesn't, usually a bad indicator. The top picture is from a chameleon. And with that one, I want to point out, especially for reptiles and birds, as was mentioned earlier, if you find an arboreal animal on the ground, that's in general a bad sign. The animal is obviously probably sick and cannot keep itself up in the leaves or on the perch. This animal as well is trembling, and you see it has some skin conditions as well, some warts or abscess, I don't know. And then this one is snake. This was a clear case of ITB, interaction with transparent boundary, and the snake just kept going. I have a video of that as well. And again, as Clifford said before, you can also look at the glass, and if you see scratches or you see like a clear dirt line besides the glass, you know the animal has been performing that behavior for a longer period of time, provided that the enclosures are cleaned every day. One of the last things, food. I think it's pretty straightforward. Water has to be clean. These are feeder animals in the water. They're dead, so probably water hasn't been changed in a long time. For food, I look at what's the condition of the food. A little bit tougher to establish if the food is species appropriate, but try if you can. The location of the food bowl, again, with birds, you probably don't want a food bowl on the ground. And ideally, food is presented in a way that it can't contaminate with the ground. And then safety. And this one is an interesting one. And I'm always surprised when I walk into facilities that I end up seeing cougars behind deer fences. It's kind of intimidating often. So I look at locks, and I look at rust and locks. And this one, even though it's just a wallaby enclosure, you don't want it's such a simple tool to have the animal being locked in. It's not only the safety of the animal, and it's not only to prevent the animal from going in, it's also to prevent people from going in that you don't want there. Animals do get stolen once in a while. The other one I would like to mention is this one, which is in the zoo. The caretaker lured a big cat into its transition enclosure, which at least they had. Some zoos don't have them at all, and people go in with the animals. And you can see this is the ledge, it's a vertical ledge. Ideally, you have horizontal slides, because vertical slides can, if they come down if they come down suddenly, and the animal can get injured. But then what the keeper needed to do is he needed to grab this big metal pole and pull it through the fencing and put it on the top of the ledge that was their safety lock. Again, if you're in a professional zoo, this doesn't happen. You have electricity, you have other methods, safe methods to enclose animals. A couple of other examples. This one at the bottom is a wolf pup behind a fencing of 120. So it could put his paws on the fencing and say hi to people and such, and probably hop over it if it really wanted it. Again and again, I notice that people underestimate the strength of animals and how dangerous they can be. This is a clear example from it. This one, the bigger lion enclosure, I look at the fencing, and as you can see, it's bent, which is usually a bad sign, because if the animal would go into it, it probably isn't very strong to keep the animal enclosed. Other things I would look at is trees around the facility. Are there any trees after a storm that can fall onto it? Especially with the bigger cats that you want to contain. Very important. And of course, fencing should be there to keep animals out and people out. And so it should be species appropriate. So even though it's just an emu, you don't want to see this kind of thing happening. I mean, there are signs up there that say don't touch the animals, and meanwhile the animals are able to reach out to people and try to get pet or food or whatever. So yeah, these are the things I look at. Hopefully that gives you some tips and ideas. Other things to consider: take lots and lots and lots of pictures and videos. especially if you do a lot of assessments, you're going to mix up the facilities you go to. Sometimes I do 2 facilities in a day. And bring backup batteries. Very important. Prioritize your enclosure, especially if you end up assessing a facility that has a bunch of them. As Adrian said before, walk through it, make sure you try to gauge like which enclosures are worst, which animals are worst off, and focus on them. For me, that usually means I skip any domesticated animals, the horses, the pigs, the goats. They deserve animal welfare as well, of course, but that's not my scope of my research usually. If you come across anything you don't know, use literature, scientific literature, to fill in the knowledge gaps. And what I've been doing is that I write assessment reports and I take Ontario legislation or wherever I am, and I compare my finding with what legislation dictates and try to indicate any points where the facility obviously is not in adherence with the law. One more thing I wanted to mention, I got a question the other day about what's my biggest challenge when I go in, and I kept thinking about that question. First I said it was time. There's always a time limitation, but what I've been noticing recently is that because I've been seeing so many facilities, is that I almost what happens is that I'm like, this is not so bad. Because you've seen so many terrible examples, you go into a facility and you're like, that's actually not too bad. But try to stay as critical as possible at all times. And if you think you can't do that, take a break from it. Because there are a lot of bad facilities out there, and yeah, there's no grading on that. Like, it has to be, like, there are good and bad ones, and something in the middle, but like make sure you're always critical and you don't get used to the standard that is currently here in Ontario, what the standard is, because that's not something we want. We need to strive for better. Thank you for your time. Any questions? Yeah.
For organizations like sanctuaries and rescue centers that don't get government funding to operate,
Yeah.
what's your advice to do both by maintaining the standards and making sure that the animals are in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know you need to make choices often in like how, where to put your money. Personally, I would say don't take on more animals than you can. Like, even though that means that there is a waiting list or whatever, you want to take care of the animals as best as you can. And I feel like a lot of places are like, oh, just keep taking in animals. It's because it's hard to say no. But my advice would be like, look at what money you can spend and adapt the amount of animals you can take in for that period of time. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you do with the information after you've compiled it? So you compare it to either provincial or municipal laws, whatever it is.
Yeah.
What do you do with it after that?
I work with Zoocheck. They take it from there and they'll go and they'll use it whenever it's appropriate for them in their campaigns. Yeah. Or any other organization for that matter. Yeah. Anybody else? All right. Thank you.